Hello YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about signal flow and why the order of your effects matters a lot in achieving specific sonic qualities. So with no further gilding of the lily, I'm going to get right on into it. So here I've got an initialized patch of Serum 2. Let's just start with a simple sound, maybe a saw with a few voices of unison. Let's just get a filter on it, give it some nice rhythmic pattern or something just to make this nice and interesting. Let's just get a nice dotted eighth on this. Right, so hopping over to the effects here, the thing that you have to note is that most of the time effects are happening in serial. I'll talk about parallel processing and buses in just a moment, but for now let's just stick with the core principle of understanding that everything is running into everything else, right? So if we get some distortion here and just give this some harmonics. Let's go with maybe something more aggressive like this diode. And then let's just get on an EQ. Just watch what happens if I put this before the distortion and then start messing with some of these settings here. So as you can see, these are affecting each other. If I put this afterwards, it's very different because the distortion isn't picking up on that boost. So when it's behind it, we get the interaction of the two of these. Whereas if it's afterwards, it's just boosting the signal after it's had the distortion applied. A really interesting way to take advantage of this is if you didn't want to distort certain frequencies, maybe you want to cut out a bit of the mids so you have a less distorted mid-range. Right? And then what we can do is we can duplicate this effects module and put it after the distortion and then just do the opposite and bring those frequencies back out after the distortion to compensate for the frequencies we've removed. So because we've balanced it, it's a similar overall level. However, the tone is very different. If I was to mute both of these, you can hear how the mid-range is much more muggy, whereas like this, you get a much purer mid-range. And so this is a really good thing to keep in mind because a lot of bass design is pretty much to do with this concept of making sure to EQ in between all of your different stages of distortion and compression and stuff like that, just to make sure that you've got full control over your sound in each stage of the process. Next up, let's go with a chorus and set up some nice delays here. Slow rate. So after the distortion, we get a much more open sound. However, before distortion, it creates this kind of ripping sound because we get in the copies first, which means there's a bit more input going into that distortion, which helps drive it more and give it this nice ripping quality. And then the detuning, of course, is going to affect how that interacts, as well as maybe changing this to high pass and selecting a specific range. You can just focus it more on the high end here. To get some more texture in the high end. But in this case, I quite like quite a lot. Maybe just mix it out a bit more. And of course, the simplest signal flow concept is just how much volume is coming out of each effect unit. And Serum 2 has got this nice volume slider at the end of each of our effects. So I can now choose how much volume is going into, let's say, the distortion. And that way you can really decide how much of each effect is actually being applied in the sound. So next up, Let's get a compressor on here and boost up the gain a bit. The distortion is already affecting the dynamics, so this is now just taming the dynamics even further. However, if I was to put this before the distortion, then I would be feeding the distortion a much more consistent signal and therefore potentially getting more distortion out of it. And then, of course, using this gain knob, I can adjust how much is being fed into that distortion to just find a nice sweet spot. As well, we have the interaction of filters. Just like the EQing, you can, choose how much of the sound is going in, which areas of the sound are going in. So perhaps you want a much more low focused sound going into the distortion, right? Or if you want it afterwards, then the distortion is happening first, then I'll be able to use the filter to let more of that distortion in. So that way I get a much warmer sound. The other type of filter that is going to affect this very drastically is a high pass. So if I go with this high pass here, then I'm cutting off all of the low end, right? But the thing is the distortion is already had that sub fed into it. So it's generating overtones based on those low frequencies, even though I've removed all the low frequencies here. Whereas if I put it before the distortion, then the distortion doesn't have that very lowest harmonic going in, and therefore is only being affected by these higher frequencies here. And higher frequencies have less energy than lower frequencies. So the distortion is now being fed a lot less, which means I can push it harder. So yeah, I'm going to just remove this effects module now and just leave it how we had it. And then spatial effects like convolution and stuff like that. Massive spaces, crystal hall, big size, low decay. And then I can put that before the distortion, and that way the distortion is going to be distorting the space itself as well. Whereas afterwards it's more transparent. So that could be a really fun one to play around with, different reverb and spatial effects going through these distortions. Especially if we have a frequency splitter to isolate the convolution on maybe just the highs. So yeah, let's get that same setup. Crystal hall or something. Change the tone and the decay. Maybe we could have a lot more mix now. And then I'll just put the EQ and distortion up in front of that splitter. There we go. I can just affect the impulse response gain here. And then the crossover here to decide how much of the signal is going to be affected by the reverb. And there you have it. That is the fundamentals of signal flow, because everything else is sort of more just delay-based effects, pretty much. And the more you play around with all of these, you start to understand the quality that each of these effects impart and their role. You start to be able to guess what the effect is going to be based on which way around you have it. If I go into the mix tab here, we got the oscillator that's going into the filter, and then this filter I'm going to send to bus 1, and then the bus 1 I'm going to go to direct out. So we're making a parallel chain now. If I go into effects and bus 1, going to make a nice spatial thing here. I am going to just link the two sides and turn it to milliseconds mode to make just a short tonal delay. If I go onto our main here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to the utility at the end and just turn this all the way down. So now I can focus on just my bus 1 sound. Let's get some distortion just to bring it out more. And then let's get on a convolver for a nice reverb. This is going to be at a very high mix level. And then I can use the compressor after the spatial effects, which will bring out any tails. If I were to put this before the spatial effect, then it would be just compressing the dry signal. But if I put it after the convolver, then you can hear how it's squeezing the sound with the reverb already applied, and therefore making that atmosphere larger and more in your face. Bring up the tails, essentially. Maybe I'll have a bit more mix on this and a bit higher tone. And then I'll just add some distortion onto the end of this. So I'm distorting that reverb and giving it some more texture as well. Let's go with maybe Sine Shaper. Brilliant. What I can do now is go back onto my main and just reset this volume. Then we can go back to the mix tab, and I can use this volume or the bus 1 send to basically blend this parallel chain in. But before I do so, I'm just going to make sure that there's no low end in our bus 1 by using an equalizer and just cutting off all of this unwanted low end so we can mix the two together in a clean fashion. So if I just take this all the way out now and just slowly bring it in. And then let's go on to our bus 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the very end of this, and I'm going to apply a bit of gain modulation to the very end of the chain, so I can just have it retain some of the dynamics of our sound. And yeah, that is going to do it for this video. I hope that gave you some insight into signal flow and the different kind of results that you can get by changing the order of some of your effects around. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do, and I'll see you on the next one.